Welcome to the office hours for the Passios Foundation's discussion of how to apply to the Calico Challenge. I wanted to speak specifically about some of the issues that I've seen over the years. The documentation is fairly clear as to what's expected. Real main issues that we have is what appears to be a general lack of preparation. We find students not reviewing the code, not trying to figure out whether they can become more aware of the underlying code base that's there and the languages that are being used. So we've had situations where students have applied saying that they know Python, and then when we ask them to write some very basic code in Python, they really don't know what to do. The other issues that we've had is students generally tend not to write very much about what they're planning on doing. So, for example, a student will say that they want to work on a specific set of issues, and they will list one or two issues that they find on GitHub and then provide no further backing information. There's one issue that's on the GitHub repository for Patu. It says that there's a need to make the installation script work automatically and install a system daemon in the right location. And students have said to me that that's what they want to work on, but they haven't said what they think the challenges would be for doing something like this. And there are a number of challenges. It looks simple on the surface, but in reality, it may not necessarily be that way. An installation script can be installed by a regular user or a system user. Certain files, for example, in the case of Python, if you're installing new Python packages as a regular user, your files get installed within your home directory. If it's a super user, it gets installed usually a system-wide location. And a system user has the option of either doing it in their home directory or the system-wide location. The installation script is going to have to ask and determine those particular types of things that need to be prompted for or automatically assumed. You're also going to have to think of a way in which you can verify that the script is actually working. The installation script all of a sudden needs a testing script. You test it to emulate a super user, you test the script to emulate the normal operation, and then if it's an installation script, you also want to write something that will then also double check that the files are put in the right location, that you have the right versions, that the dependencies are there. For something that looks as simple as an installation script can quite often be much more complicated. Give some sort of idea that you understand some of the challenges. PowerPoint makes it very easy to create circles and squares and arrows. Just basic concepts about what you're planning on doing can be illustrated with a few simple graphics that don't take really a lot of time to do. That also provides more background. Having a GitHub account, some sort of activity with that GitHub account is really important too. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have the world's best code, but the fact that you have code up there allows us to investigate the quality of your code, the expectations that we can see of you, the degree of documentation that you've written inside the code, the general flow of the code, the consistency of the code, whether all the functions are labeled so that we can determine how you would be able to succeed. Similarly, we will have students describe what they have done, explaining they have done well in competitions or that they feel that they have the right attitude, that they work well in teams, that they have good understanding and knowledge and easily grab concepts, but they don't tell the whole story because we have no background. If you can present us with something tangible, that is good. But ultimately, we need to see code. Therefore, having it available on GitHub helps. If you've done some amount of modification to it, if you've forked code and you've modified it, made submissions to the open source project, that really helps. You can practice using GitHub with our Aki and Solfish recipe repository. Even if you have no coding experience, just the whole process of trying to submit a recipe, learning how to create restructured text documents, which are a requirement of all the documentation that we're going to require, just having that ability to submit that information to a repository that has nothing to do with coding also helps to show that you are familiar with the concepts of GitHub in terms of git push, git pull, that you can format documentation, etc. All the documentation for Talawa that you see online, all the documentation that you see for Patu was written in restructured text and is a part of each individual code repository. If you're going to be adding features that require any sort of explanation, then there's going to need to be documentation that is supporting it. And so therefore, the mere understanding of how documentation is updated is extremely important to us. Do you have any questions?
So does a beginner fare in applying?
There are issues on our repositories that are designed for beginners. They focus on specific sections of code, and therefore you can become proficient in those sections before expanding into other areas of broader knowledge. A good example would be writing testing code, where you may have a function in a library that you may want to import into your testing script, and then you provide that function with various values with the expectation of getting known outputs when the test is run. Writing unit tests can focus on multiple functions in a single file, in a single library. Therefore, the scope is very easy for beginners. If the documentation states that you're a beginner and that you have shown some amount of initiative in either creating code and posting it to the web so that we can see it, even if the code is 50 lines, 100 lines of code, it provides us with something. If the code is well documented, the discipline of having good structured code, all the variables and what you're doing with the variables are defined, what the function aims to do is defined. Those sorts of things help us to understand whether you have some of the basic understandings of being a good coder. Because quite often, when you're writing code, you're not the only person who's going to be modifying it in future. It really is a question of the way you present yourself and the way that you can recognize some of these limitations as well. If you say on the documentation that you're being a this is the code that I've worked on, and these are the specific areas or the specific things that you're interested in working on, and what you have discovered about that particular section of the code, and what you've discovered about those particular concepts, that is helpful to us. It's one thing to have somebody who understands code and does not apply themselves. We want people to apply themselves and become better coders over the summer. And so if you can give us some degree of assurance that this is something that you're interested in, then that can be very helpful. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah, it helps. Yes, thank you.
And so what's your background in coding? Do you consider yourself a beginner?
No, no, I just think I don't have much experience. I think I know out of the concepts that I learned from school, but I just haven't been on any projects to apply them to. So I wouldn't really call myself a beginner, so I still do have much experience.
Have you written scripts on your own that are outside of the school curriculum?
Yes, yeah.
That would be something that you could potentially put online for people to look at.
But the application,
Yeah, so you
oh,
would have code, get a GitHub account, create a repository, put that code up there, make sure the code is well documented. If you can, create a README file, put the README file in the directory. Make sure that the README file looks good when you go to GitHub so that people can see it. Those are the types of things that are going to be important. When you're writing your application, you can say, "Well, I don't have much experience with coding, but this is what I've written. These were what the challenges were. This is why I chose this particular approach. This is what I would have liked to have done to make it better." And similarly, in the area of this software repository, I would like to be able to do something similar. And once again, detail as to what those particular things are going to be, what you think the use cases are going to be, some of the challenges you're going to face, some of the edge cases that could potentially be there would be another thing. And so that's very important as well. If you are going to be making a presentation to a management team about why you feel that your project is going to work, you'd be expected to write some sort of a PowerPoint presentation to show that you're serious about it. And so why not in this particular situation? We have a number of donors and sponsors to the Calico Challenge each year, and they are quite often Jamaican-based companies. And they want to make sure that they're getting value for money when they are putting their philanthropic dollars where their mouths are. And they want to make sure that the students are successful. And quite often they will hire students that come out of the program based on the presentations they make at the end of the summer. And so, therefore, if you can put yourself in good standing and on good footing from the very beginning, that can be very helpful.
would being a part of a larger project, say you contributed code before, help significantly.
It would, and once again, if you can show that you've made the contributions, that would be helpful. I know that in many of the school environments, the ability to display what you've done is very difficult because a lot of the code is not put on the web. But if you describe what you did, that would be helpful. But really and truly, we need to see the ability to code and the ability of what you've been able to do and some amount of a history, if possible, of what you've done in the past. Because yeah, it's easy to hide what you've done when you're working in a group, right? You may have 10 people or 5 people working in a group and you come up with something great. But we all know that quite often it's only 1 or 2 people doing the real work and everybody else is just hanging on. And so, how do you prove that you were the real one that was actually doing the work? The only way to prove that, or with very little doubt, is to be able to show your coding levels in in GitHub so that we can review the code and determine the degree to which you really understand what the concepts are.
So if it is on GitHub and you can see the contributions, that's good.
Yeah.
Alright.
And we've been consistent about saying this to people all along. If somebody does not have a GitHub account and they've applied for the Calico challenge or repositories are on GitHub, then why should we even look at their application any further? Similarly, if you are in IT and you are an IT student and you don't have a website, that also makes us wonder whether you're really serious about the profession. Equally, if you're going into the work world and you don't have a LinkedIn account that we can double check to see whether you have any connections or if there's anybody that we may know we can get a second reference from, that also helps us. Anything that you can do to make your presence seen and visible and verifiable helps us in making that final decision. All right, so Taj, you have any questions?
I have a question. What if I don't have much like experience working on open source projects, but like the projects I've worked on have been more private?
We need to have some way in which we can see your code. And so therefore you don't necessarily have to have all the private stuff up on the web. If it's proprietary for any reason, you've done private work for a company and that's expected to remain private, then it doesn't make sense. It wouldn't be wise to have that code up there. Everybody who's a coder has written something. They've written a web scraping script or a Twitter bot. People have done things, and there's no shame in showing some of the small stuff that you've done, some of the larger things that you've done, just so that people are aware of what you've done. And that helps to provide context for us.
Yeah, I mostly only have like school projects on my GitHub and for
Okay.
web development.
Okay. Well, if that is on GitHub, that is helpful. And those school projects are exclusively yours.
Yes, they are.
Okay. And so therefore that provides us with some background. As I was telling everybody before, some of the other things that are important is that if you're looking at some of the issues that we have on the GitHub account, we need to understand what you think some of the edge cases would be, some of the criteria you would be needing, how would you write the test cases for it, maybe do some data flow diagrams, maybe some rudimentary flow charts, some what if analysis, describe what you think some of the challenges would be if this thing scales with the approach that you're using. Those sorts of things would be very helpful. So, Joanna, I think you started speaking, but then we didn't hear anything more.
Yes, sir. I was going to ask, earlier you were talking about being specific when we are addressing, and you mentioned it just now, when we're addressing what we'd want to do. Um, would you think of this like in relation to a particular language or framework as well, or just the concept of what we'd be implementing.
Qu- Yeah, so the language and framework of what you'll be working on is important to some degree, but what we're really looking at is the thought process behind you are going to be doing. If, for example, in the case of Flutter, you look at it and say, well, I want to rewrite the whole Tallow application in new framework. That wouldn't necessarily be the best thing to propose because we've put in or maybe hundreds and hundreds of hours in writing that code, and it's not going to be rewritten all of a sudden over the summer. And so quite often you'll find yourself getting into a new coding environment, and you have to live with what you have. You would have to say, okay, given the current constraints that I have, this is what I'd like to work on, and maybe describe some of the features of um, of the of the software that you're planning on using. So let's say, for example, someone is going to be adding new functionality to a web app. How are you going to manage the um, the maintenance of state between screens? How do you maintain state if somebody's moving between cell towers and their IP address may be changing? What other methodologies could you be working on? If with this feature, will it work with 7 people? Or will it work with 100,000 people? And what do you think would be some of the limitations of getting to 100,000? If you don't think the application is going to be used by 100,000 people now, well, maybe a 10,000 person solution might work if it's simple enough, and then we can figure out ways in which that code could be replaced at a later stage. Similarly, like if someone there was a good question that somebody asked quite recently. They said, "I want to work on add an administrator page to the Patu web pages," and automatically the question now becomes, how does the person authenticate to get into that page? Where is that data going to be stored? Is it going to be stored in the existing database, or is it going to be stored in a new database? If it's in a new database, is that why? What sort of information is going to be stored? How much of that information is going to be encrypted or not? Do we just encrypt the username and password? Do we just do the password? Do we encrypt everything? How do we decrypt it when the time comes? Where's that decryption key going to be? Right, some sort of exploration as to what those sorts of things might mean. If you are going to be writing menus and describing the menus, um, it's good to talk about some of the workflows of the screens, um, and to describe what you're planning on doing. Many times people who are using mobile apps, they may not necessarily have a lot of dexterity, so the images and numbers need to be big. They may not be able to see very well, so they may need to use imagery. They may not be able to read very well, so they may need to limit the number of words that you have and use imagery to a larger extent. Those sorts of considerations need to be thought of and explained, and you describe how you're going to overcome these things when you are um, describing what you're planning on doing. So those things are really important as well. So it's not just the framework. It's quite often the technology is the tool to solve the problem, and as you solve problems, other problems arise, and that is one of the issues. I'll give you a very good example of how we use a variety of technologies for Patu to make it reliable. In my experience with working with internet and IT systems, one of the things that almost always eventually has some sort of an issue is connectivity to a database, especially if you're using something in a remote office, or um, even within your local network. Things may clog up the network and you don't have access. The UTech Wi-Fi network is a good case in point. If you have an app and you are trying to get in contact with the internet, from time to time it may go down, even though the database itself may be up. The access may go down. So how do you get around those sorts of problems? Many of these apps, when you're writing them, you're assuming that there's going to be constant connectivity to the back end. So what I've done in some cases, and what I think I've done in the Patu situation, one of the things that you can do is you can make a request to the server at the far end to say, what do I have to poll or what do I have to do? And that's a single request. That agent or whatever it may be goes out, does that stuff, and then posts it back to the central server. If that posting fails, the software shouldn't crash. That data is transient. If you go and ask for that data again, it's a different time. The value may have changed. You're going to need to be able to store that data locally. And so the data is stored locally. And the next time you go and send data, if the server responds and says, I'm okay, then all the remaining data that you've stored on the local disk should then be posted back to the central server. So there's a fail-safe. Trying to find or think of the practicalities of some of those issues is important. Now, if you decide to post data directly to a server so that it goes and gets posted straight into the database immediately, there are potential issues with that as well. And one of the potential issues is that your database may not be run on the latest hardware. It may be slow. There may be lots of connections going back to that particular system. How do you handle that? One way in which that we've done that with Batum is that when the data gets posted to the central server, it doesn't go to the database. It gets written to disk immediately. And it's a very quick operation. JSON data gets posted, the JSON data gets stored on disk immediately with a file name that is time-stamped. There's a batch job that goes through every so often, reads all those files all at once. That batch job is located closer to the database server, so the likelihood of some sort of network issue or other types of issue causing interruptions are much less. And then that posts the data into the database as a batch. It arranges all the records, it sorts all the records, and so the records are dumped rather than one record at a time. They're dumped all at once, which is a much more efficient operation. Those are the types of things that can be thought through. Do we expect that degree of thoughtfulness in a Calico application? No, not necessarily. But it would be good to see if somebody has thought through to say, what could go wrong based on my experiences? How can I, as a software developer, ensure that in 3 weeks after I've written the code for my boss, I don't get woken up at midnight to try and fix a problem for tomorrow morning, right? And so those sorts of things need to be thought through as a part of the design. Any other questions?
For the Telawa project, there are some features that core features they want to implement, it, and for my proposal, I said I would be able to implement one of those, and I made two additional recommendations that weren't a part of the core features. Would that be okay to
Abs-
propose?
Absolutely. The whole idea behind this is not to be constrained by what we think is required. As the coders write code, we realize that there are things that need to be done later on, and so we create issues just to remind us that that is a part of what's going to be required. If somebody looks at this and says, well, this is only the tip of the iceberg, we could probably add additional things to it, then that would be helpful. And as I said before, if you can add diagrams to show it, if you can do some pseudocode to show that you understand what you're talking about, if you can explain what you think some of the limitations are going to be, then that helps greatly. Too often we have applications in which every single section is one or two sentences, and we have no ability to determine whether the person is a suitable candidate, and that makes it extremely difficult for us. Make sense?
That makes sense.
I see where someone in the chat has asked about the number of persons per team. It really depends on how many people we're going to be having applying for each of the various projects. It depends on how much sponsorship we get. Typically, we have 2 or 3 people working on different sections of projects. There are some other things to consider. In the case of Tallow, we have almost no continuous integration and it is not as reliable as it should be. And so any features that you add, make sure that there's time and effort placed into making sure that your code works all the time, every time, in an automated fashion. In the case of Patu, about 95% of the code is continuously tested with the Travis CI GitHub integration. You may have noticed that we don't ask any questions about your grades, we don't ask any questions about awards. We really only ask questions about what you can do. We've done that on purpose to try and find the people who can do what they say they can do. If it's a small amount that they can do right now, we're hoping that by the time they finish, they'll be able to do a large amount. It's really important also, if you're working on the Patu projects, to be reasonably competent in the use of Linux. The Linux command line is something that's going to be used all the time with Patu. And the reason for that is because many of the unit tests are going to be run from the command line. In some cases, you're going to have to look at Linux log files, which sometimes requires privileged access. And remember, the code is not written for Windows. Similarly, if you're using Android Studio or whatever the application IDE is for the Tallow app, knowledge of the background of that app, knowledge of the operating system on which it's running is also important. And one last tip, make absolutely sure that you get in contact with a mentor. They will be able to provide you with insights into the project, critical aspects of the features and issues, and give you a good understanding as to what to expect over the summer. Very important. All right, we're almost at the end of time. I've done preaching. Anybody else has any questions before we leave? So in summary, make sure that your applications are as comprehensive as possible. Thank you.